In this video, we will examine the redundancy principle, which is one of Dr. Mayer's principles aimed at minimizing extraneous processing, so that learners can more effectively process essential information in an effort to retain knowledge or skills from your lesson. The redundancy principle generally states that when you are pairing visual elements of a presentation with words, present words as either on-screen text or narration, but do not use both simultaneously. When presenting multimedia content that includes both visual elements and words, consider how you will elaborate on those visual elements. By and large, you have two ways to describe visuals, either on-screen text or verbal narration. As we know, learners have two distinct channels through which they intake new information during multimedia presentations: a visual channel, their eyes, and an auditory channel, their ears. If you present the words of your presentation as both on-screen text and verbal narration, your learners are essentially processing the same information twice. In doing so, that information becomes redundant and leads to extraneous processing. Too much extraneous processing can negatively impact student learning. Now you might be thinking to yourself, this is very similar to the modality principle, which, if you remember, states that words should be presented in a spoken format rather than as on-screen text. Collectively, the modality principle and the redundancy principle support the notion that you should elaborate on visual elements of your presentation with spoken words only, and that you should remove most, if not all, of the corresponding on-screen text. In reality, this is a difficult practice to implement for most presenters, myself included. To that end, let's consider some practical guidelines to follow to determine how much on-screen text is appropriate. First, it is important to remember that the redundancy principle only applies when there is some pictorial information being displayed. In the absence of pictorial information, it is of course good practice to share some on-screen text to reinforce main ideas or concepts being discussed verbally. A second exception for including on-screen text with corresponding graphics happens when there is ample opportunity for the learners to process the pictorial information being displayed. This happens when the on-screen text and corresponding graphics are presented sequentially, or when the pace of the presentation is sufficiently slow for the learners in attendance. The last exception is likely also to be the most practical option to consider. Rather than eliminating all on-screen text, opt instead to limit on-screen text to the most important concepts, ideas, or parts of processes or procedures that are being discussed. Allow learners to create connections between verbally presented ideas and pictorially represented elements of your presentation. In doing so, you allow learners a chance to actively process the verbal and pictorial models they are mentally creating, which is an important component of generative processing. Without this active processing, which is an inherently personal component of learning, long-term retention of knowledge is unlikely. In our next video, we will focus on the coherence principle, which is related to the idea of minimizing extraneous processing. Until next time.